All right, welcome to our lecture on how development is defined and measured, and the slides are put together to accompany the textbook People, Place, and Culture. And I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your lecturer for the day. So the first thing we need to talk about when we talk about development is how it's defined. Okay, first of all, when we talk about development, a lot of people tend to equate that in terms of wealth and how much wealth a country has. But wealth doesn't only depend on what a country produces, but also in large part on how it's produced and where it's produced. So you can have very different areas in a country, some areas that are very, very wealthy and some areas that are really incredibly poverty-stricken. And a great example of this might be if we were to compare, say, New York City, which is a wealthy place by and large, especially if we look, say, at Manhattan, and take that and compare it to someplace like an Indian reservation, especially if we're talking about an Indian reservation in the middle of the country. Oftentimes in those areas, there's incredibly grinding poverty, the kind of poverty you might expect to find in a less developed country. So when we're talking about development and we're talking about measuring and defining development, we really need to keep in mind that that there are wide variations, not just between countries, but also within countries. Okay, and then when we're talking about between countries, what we need to look at is we've got more developed countries, read wealthy. By and large, the U.S. fits into this category, right? Western Europe, Japan, you know the list. And we've got less developed, and these are our poor countries. Largely, we tend to think of these as being much of Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. It's important to note not all of Africa falls into that less developed category. And some areas of Southeast Asia, and arguably some areas potentially of Latin America. But there's this whole middle category that we haven't really talked about a whole lot, and that's countries that are developing. Okay, and countries that are developing are countries that are making progress in terms of technology, in developing it, using it, getting people access to it. They're making progress in terms of production, so they're building up their economic well-being, and also their what's called socioeconomic well-being. Socioeconomic is kind of a broad category, but it encompasses not just money and economics, but also some of those more fuzzy, feel-good kind of ways of measuring development. So how's the society as a whole doing? And then there's really three major ways to define development or to measure development. And each of these is going to come into play when we talk about different measures. Okay, so we can talk about economic welfare, and that again is a focus on, for instance, how much does a country make? How much money does a country make? Talk about development in terms of technology and production, and so that's that. Where do they fit along the scale of are they mostly primary industries? Are they mostly secondary industries? Are they mostly tertiary industries? And then we can also talk about development in terms of social welfare. And this, again, social welfare, kind of like socioeconomic, it's a little more fuzzy. Social welfare are things like literacy rates. They're things like childhood poverty. They're things like how many girls attend school, or how many children live beyond the age of 5. Okay, so they're fuzzy in the sense that they're warm and feel good categories, or maybe cold and not so good, depending on where you're at. But they're also typically very, very easy to measure. Okay. So then when we talk about some definitions, one of the big things we need to talk about when we're defining development is what's called gross national income. Okay, in gross national income, we can break it down into a few different ways, and we'll talk about an actual definition of gross national income in a minute, but we can look at GNP, which is the gross national product, okay? And that's just a measure of the total value of the officially recorded goods and services produced by the citizens and corporations of a country in a given year, okay? And it includes things made both inside and outside the country's territory. And there's a few things that I want to draw your eye to with this definition. One is that idea of officially recorded. Okay, so this is not things in the informal economy, and we'll talk about informal economy in a minute. But rather things that can be taxed, things that can be measured. Okay, And also GNP, you gotta know, includes things both inside and outside the country's territory. And I mentioned that second part specifically because another way to measure gross national income is to talk about what's called gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is very, very similar, except with the big difference that the goods and services have to be produced within the country during the given year. So it's still that total value of officially recorded goods and services, but again, they're the ones produced inside of a country, and that's the difference between gross national product and gross domestic product. Okay, then to take it out a little bit more, we'll talk about gross national income, and remember I promised you a definition here, is the monetary worth of what is produced within a country plus, so it's that gross domestic product plus the income received from investments outside the country, okay, minus income payments to other countries. So whatever we make investing outside the country minus whatever we're paying to other countries, and you add that all to basically the GDP. The most common way to standardize gross national income data is to divide it by the population of the country. And anytime we're dividing something by a population, we're always going to call it per capita. Okay? Per capita, think per person. It's an average. Okay, so when we standardize GNI data that way, we get what's called the per capita GNI. Okay, and it's important to know when we're talking about development that within any given country, there's really two types of economies. Okay, and this applies to every single country in the world, whether it's the US or whether it's Zimbabwe or Mexico or China or Japan, okay? Australia, doesn't matter. There's the formal economy, and that's the legal economy that governments tax and monitor, right? You go to work, your boss cuts you a paycheck, you pay taxes, you're working in the formal economy. The informal economy is uncounted and or technically illegal economy that governments don't tax or keep track of. Okay, and the informal economy, think of it this way. If you babysit at all, for instance, you babysit, you get paid in cash, you're not paying any taxes on it. The government has no clue whether you worked or not. That's the informal economy. Okay, and more developed countries, most of their gross national income comes in the formal economy, or most of their income in general for people comes from the formal economy. Less developed countries, especially countries with a large problem with poor governance, which we'll talk about in our political geography unit, but just know that countries with poor governance generally have a much larger informal economy. Okay? So continuing with this talk of gross national income, the trick with using averages is that averages mask extremes in the distribution within a given country. Okay, so the gross national income for the U.S. includes Bill Gates, right, and includes Warren Buffett, but it also includes the homeless guy on the corner holding the sign that says, "We'll work for food." So it really masks those extremes and gives us a number that's not really super representative, okay? And then we're talking about GNI per capita and what it measures. It's also important to note that it measures only production, not only the outputs, only the products, right? It doesn't take into account those non-monetary costs of production. And non-monetary costs of production, these are things like the wear and tear on the environment that a factory might give that it doesn't pay taxes on. Okay? So you got to kind of remember that yeah, it's a measure, but it's got its limits. Okay? And these limitations on gross national income have prompted a lot of analysts to start to look for alternative ways to measure economic development, ways that take account of the role of technology, of production, of transportation, of communications. Okay? And some of those non-monetary costs of production. Other ways to look at this are to focus on social welfare. We're talking about how a country is developed, right, and how we define that development, how we measure it. So we could, for instance, look at the dependency ratio, and if you remember from our population unit, the dependency ratio is the number of dependents, that is to say the very young and the very old, that each 100 employed people must support. Okay, so it's just a way of saying how many people rely on help, and how many people are giving the help. Okay. High dependency ratios can result in significant economic and social strains, and the specifics of those strains are going to vary from country to country. It's going to vary depending on whether your economic ratio is high with the young, whether it's high with the old, or for a handful of very unfortunate countries, whether it's high at both ends. Okay, and you've got comparatively fewer people in the middle. But one of those things you got to remember is that when we're putting together these ways of measuring development and so forth, is that there's a ton of statistics we could use to measure social welfare, right? We could use literacy rates, we can use infant mortality, we can use life expectancy, we could use caloric intake per person, or the percentage of family income spent on food, and the amount of savings, right? We could measure maternal mortality, right? That's deaths in childbirth. All kinds of stuff that we could measure to try and define what development is and define how we measure it. And depending on what we use for the statistics, that's going to make a big difference potentially in the outcomes we get. And just to give you an example, if we look at, say, healthcare spending per capita, right? The U.S. spends a ton, a lot more than any other country on healthcare. And our outcomes are actually worse than a lot of countries over in Europe. So does that mean we're less developed than those countries? Then if you turn it around and you look at, say, GDP per capita, we're actually significantly higher than a lot of those countries. So does that mean that we're more developed? Okay, so a lot of this has to do with what statistics we're using to do the defining and the measuring. And that's something to keep in mind as you're reading the chapter, as you're reading any of the articles and things, and as we're talking about development, that a lot of it depends on definitions. Okay, so this has been our lecture on some of the ways to measure development. We talked about gross domestic product, we talked about gross national product and other monetary ways to measure development. We also talked just a little bit about some of the non-monetary ways to measure development, some of the, for lack of a better term, soft and fuzzy ways and statistics to use. And we also talked about what are some of the drawbacks to each of those approaches. So if you have any questions, I'd invite you to bring them to class and to ask them of me in person. And I will see you the next time we meet.